Silver dust on busted boots, helmet glass, my haunted face. Purple storms and silent loops trace your name across this place. I'm in the orbit of the unseen. Something moves just past the screen. Breathing in a language.
Analog gods. How a Silicon Valley cult, an ancient language, and a broken projector revealed a hidden universe. Part 1. The Poster. I wasn't looking for a cult. I was looking for coffee. That distinction mattered to me at the time. It still does, though mainly for legal and philosophical reasons. It was late October, one of those Bay Area mornings when the light on University Avenue in Palo Alto seemed almost offensively well-funded. The storefront glass shone with startup optimism. The sycamores dropped leaves with curated reluctance. Men who had never once in their lives used the word estivation spoke confidently into phones about alignment, leverage, and planetary scale. The air smelled of espresso, eucalyptus, and expensive conviction. I had been awake most of the night in the basement of Stanford's Classics building, trying to decide whether a set of late Greek ritual syllables were copied corruptly from Coptic, misheard from Aramaic, or were simply a scribe's revenge on posterity. My dissertation concerned what scholars, when trying to sound sensible, called non-semantic ritual language in late antique magical texts. What that usually meant was that I spent my days knee-deep in strings of apparently meaningless sounds that had once been pronounced in dark rooms by people who hoped the universe might answer back. The working title of Chapter 3 was When Nonsense Preserves Technique. No one in the department liked it. I adored it. I came up the avenue half-blind with fatigue, heading for a coffee shop whose barista had once correctly identified a cardigan on my laptop, and for that alone deserved my loyalty forever. I would have gone past the theater if a flicker of blue had not caught my eye. The theater stood wedged between retail modernity and civic amnesia, one of the last old houses left on the avenue. Its marquee had been restored, not renovated, an important distinction, and its narrow lobby still smelled faintly of dust, brass polish, and 27 generations of butter. A hand-painted sign beside the ticket box announced a revival series of Cold War science fiction and one stubbornly unprofitable Czech New Wave retrospective. The letters in the glass case reflected the morning traffic in broken gold, and there, amid the posters for rep screenings and local events, was the thing that stopped me. It was a flyer or poster, though neither word quite did it justice. It looked too lovingly wrong, too specific. The paper stock was heavy, almost velvety. The design was pure retro-futurist delirium, saturated midnight blues, pale atomic glow. A squat machine like an optimistic 1950s television set, crossbred with laboratory equipment and taught to keep a secret. Across the top, in huge, friendly letters, it said, "Calling for Multiverse Voyagers. We need your help." Below that was a picture of the machine. It had a circular central viewport, two side panels labeled with nonsense pseudo-instrument names, orange dials, tiny blue feet like it might step off the page if sufficiently encouraged. Inside its central window was what looked like a small interior room lit by impossible amber light, as though the machine didn't display images so much as kept another place on loan. At the bottom right was a Polaroid-style square showing a blurred figure, not a clear human shape, not clearly non-human either, more like a standing smudge in fog, with a white question mark where a face might have been. Pinned to the Polaroid was a crooked scrap of paper with a handwritten note. "This creature seems to know where to unlock the multiverse. We need to find it." I laughed once quietly, not because it was ridiculous, because it was almost not. "There are many ways to bait a person like me, and most are embarrassingly cheap. Mention a dead language. Use the word signal instead of vision. Add one badly photocopied question mark and a device that looks like it belongs in an alternate 1962. You don't need a net, you need a little graphic design and some nerve. Still, I might have walked away if the phrasing had not bothered me. I stood there longer than was socially acceptable in Palo Alto, and longer than was safe for me. The wording had a cadence I recognized from translated materials, not the obvious parts. The article choices, the placement of seams, the way "unlock the multiverse" sat in the sentence like an imported idiom. It felt less like a native speaker improvising whimsy than like someone, or something, working through a second-hand template for persuasion. A cult poster, in other words, or a badly translated distress signal. One had to maintain standards. I looked around to see whether anyone was watching me in the predatory way outreach people often do. No one was. The avenue went on being itself. A cyclist in soft black layers went by holding a croissant like a legal document. A woman in yoga clothes explained machine learning to a terrier. The world did not seem arranged for my ensnarement. At the bottom left of the poster was a QR code. It is one of the more humiliating features of my life that I scanned it. The link opened to a site called Bay Area Voyagers. The homepage was all brushed metal fonts and language about signal archaeology, adjacent worlds, continuity media, and citizen explorers for a new frontier of contact. There were photographs of old tape decks, optical projectors, vacuum tubes, handwritten notebooks, and a large blue prototype identical to the device on the poster. A banner at the top said, "A structured signal was detected. Instructions were embedded. We are building the console." There was a form beneath. Have you ever felt called by an anomaly? Do old devices seem more alive than new ones? Do you believe the universe is larger sideways than upward? I should have stopped there. Instead, I filled it out while standing in front of the theater in broad daylight with one hand around a paper coffee cup and the other betraying the rest of me at high speed. Name, email, area of expertise. I typed graduate student, ancient languages, ritual texts, history of the occult. Under, why are you interested in becoming a Voyager? I wrote, because fatigue removes the safety rails from irony. Because most people don't build retro consoles unless they're hiding a scam or a theorem, and I am professionally curious which this is. I hit submit. Then I went into the coffee shop, bought the strongest thing they sold, and sat by the window looking back at the theater poster as though it might, under observation, explain itself or apologize. It did neither. Instead, 20 minutes later, I received an email. Elias Mercer, we've been hoping someone with your background would find us. That should have frightened me more than it did. At the time, it felt like flattery, which I later learned is often just fear arriving with better posture. Part 2. Bay Area Voyagers. The first meeting took place 3 nights later in a warehouse on the edge of Redwood City that had been converted, with great care and slightly more money than taste, into the sort of space people in the Bay Area call intentional. Exposed beams, polished concrete, industrial lamps, too much fern. Somewhere a scent diffuser was fighting a losing battle against solder and dust. A discreet sign at the entrance said Bay Area Voyagers in a font that managed to suggest both government surplus and spiritual awakening. Inside, old machines lined the walls like reliquaries, shortwave radios, reel-to-reel decks, test oscilloscopes, projection heads, field telephones, analog synthesizer modules mounted in brushed steel frames. Some worked, some had clearly been purchased for atmosphere. All had been polished into righteousness. A volunteer with earnest eyes and a lanyard approached before I had fully committed to being in the room. "You must be Elias," he said. "I'm Milo." He looked 25 or perhaps 30 in the way graduate students and underpaid non-profits distort age. Thin, friendly, slightly over-caffeinated, wearing the expression of someone who had once wanted to believe in something and recently found a model available in monthly installments. "I'm not committed to having arrived," I said. "That's okay," he said brightly. "Most thresholds are reversible." That should have warned me, too. He gave me a badge that said Voyager Guest and a paper booklet printed on thick cream stock. On the front was the same blue machine from the poster, only now I could see more detail. Dials labeled field map and optic, a glowing round viewport, a side knob like an old radio tuning cylinder. The design was ridiculous in precisely the way competent fraud often is, stylized enough to disarm skepticism, specific enough to imply underlying function. The crowd that evening was about 40 people, students, engineers, a woman in her 50s who looked like she had opinions about church organs, two men who could have been venture capitalists or performance artists, which is not a distinction Palo Alto reliably maintains. One very solemn teenager in a thrifted suit. A couple who, from the angle of their mutual attention, had either just met or been married too long. The room had the hum of people waiting to be told their eccentricity might finally be a specialization. A woman in black silk with a tablet stepped lightly between small clusters of guests, greeting each by name before they introduced themselves. She was in her early 40s, perhaps, with a composure so exact it looked engineered. Her hair was clipped at the nape, her voice low, her attention terrifyingly calibrated. When she reached me, she smiled as if we were already in the middle of a conversation she had decided I would enjoy. "Elias Mercer," she said, "ancient languages. That's what my paperwork alleges." The smile widened by 0.5 millimeter. "I'm Lenora Quist," she said. "Operations Director. We're delighted you came." Operations Director was an interesting title for a group recruiting Multiverse volunteers. It sounded less like revelation than procurement. Before I could ask the obvious, the lights dimmed and a man stepped onto the small stage at the far end of the warehouse. He was taller than I expected and thinner, with a face made striking less by beauty than by intensity and exhaustion agreeing to collaborate. He wore a charcoal suit without tie, wire-rimmed glasses, and the expression of a man who had spent a long time trying to convince smarter people than himself that he was right, and failing that, had built his own audience. "Good evening," he said. "I'm Adrian Vale." No music, no applause prompt, no booming intro video. That, oddly, made him more persuasive. "We're often asked," he said, "whether Bay Area Voyagers is a research collective, a community, a technical fellowship, or a spiritual project. The answer is yes, but only because we lack better nouns." A small laugh moved through the room. He let it. "3 years ago," he continued, "our broader network detected a structured anomaly in an analog optical chain. Not radio, not conventional electromagnetic transmission, not anything our digital analysis pipelines could classify without destroying the thing we were trying to observe." Behind him, a screen lit up with grainy images of old projectors, tape decks, waveforms, and a dark field threaded with white points. "We believe," Adrian said, "that intelligence adjacent to our own, parallel, not extraterrestrial in the usual science-fictional sense, has been attempting low-bandwidth contact across layered realities. Not through our most advanced systems, but through our oldest. The media we discarded are precisely the media ambiguous enough to hear." That line landed harder than it should have, because there was enough technical language in it to flatter the rational and enough poetry to flatter the wounded. "Digital systems," he said, "resolve too aggressively. They classify, compress, synchronize, and discard. Analog systems drift. They preserve ambiguity. Sometimes ambiguity is noise. Sometimes it is a doorway." On the screen appeared the blue machine from the poster. "This," he said, "is the first generation of what we call a multiverse console. Not a portal, not a fantasy device. A coupled analog environment designed from signal instructions embedded in the anomaly itself." He clicked to a slide showing strange strings of letters, vowels, clusters, phonetic fragments. These sequences appeared alongside the technical packet. "We believe they are performance instructions, linguistic, acoustic, perhaps ritual in origin. Our best guess is that historical cultures encountered similar transmissions and preserved fragments as incantations, sacred names, or so-called nonsense speech." I sat up so abruptly the woman beside me glanced over. Adrian saw it. "Mr. Mercer," he said into the room, as if he had merely noticed me naturally, and not because Lenora had already profiled everyone. You look unconvinced or interested. We'll accept either. The room turned with the lazy appetite of groups for public reaction. I cleared my throat. I'm interested in why you think those are linguistic rather than, say, random artifacts humans impose pattern on because we dislike silence. Excellent, Adrian said. Pattern hunger is always the first suspect. That's why we need people trained to distinguish structure from projection. He clicked again. On the screen, 2 lines of transliteration appeared, one Greek, one gibberish of a familiar kind. These have correspondences to late antique ritual texts, he said, or enough to trouble us. We were hoping someone with your background might help determine whether the ancients were preserving residue, procedure, or both. Hope is a manipulative word when used publicly. The crowd turned back to me not with hostility, but with that slightly feverish admiration groups reserve for a specialist who might bless their interests with legitimacy. I made the mistake of not immediately leaving. After the talk, Milo found me by the tea urn. That was great, he said. I don't think I said anything great. You asked the right kind of question. That is very generous of you and a little ominous. He grinned. You'll fit. I haven't decided to fit. Thresholds, he said, holding up both hands. Reversible. Lenora appeared at my elbow as though called by the word fit. Adrian would like you to see the archive room, she said. Only if you have time. That is another sentence with a surprisingly high conversion rate. The archive room was really a lab space staged as a monastery for obsolete media. Tape reels in labeled drawers, shelves of notebooks, optical reader assemblies, vacuum tubes displayed upright like a choir of glass organs. On a center table lay printouts of the transliterated sequences Adrian had shown. He entered carrying 2 mugs and handed one to me. It contained tea so expensive it tasted like a second opinion. I mean this sincerely, he said. Your research may matter here. That is the most dangerous thing anyone could say to a graduate student. For the first time, his face relaxed into amusement. Then I'll say something safer. We don't know what we have. He showed me spectrograms, signal fragments, hand-drawn diagrams of acoustic couplings, and a short video clip of the console's viewport blooming with distortion while someone off-screen voiced a sequence of vowels. The engineer in me, which is to say the part of my mind raised by grammars, not circuits, saw enough inconsistency to be suspicious. The historian in me saw enough resemblance to old ritual tech to be hooked. As I left, Lenora handed me a folder. We meet weekly, she said, and there are deeper practice sessions for those who can contribute specialized knowledge. Define deeper. More technically demanding, she said smoothly. Also more honest. Outside, Redwood City smelled of wet asphalt and freight. I stood by my bike, folder under my arm, and read the label on the cover. Bay Area Voyagers. Field Materials. Linguistic Layer. On the train back to Palo Alto, I told myself, with all the authority of a man on the brink of making his own life difficult, that I was not joining anything. I was conducting research. That is how a great many bad decisions begin in academic prose. Part 3. Barbarous Words. The first file I opened at home made the hairs on my arms rise for reasons I was not proud of. Not because it was supernatural, because it was annoyingly familiar. The transcript labeled Phonetic Layer/Session 9 contained strings that looked, at first glance, like the usual detritus one gets whenever humans try to hear language in uncertain noise. Repeated vowels, broken consonants, nonsensical compounds, abrupt reversals, terms that almost meant something in Greek before swerving into no known morphology. But after 15 minutes, then 30, then 2 indecent hours under a desk lamp with my notebook spread around me like a paper crime scene, I stopped trying to read them semantically. That was the trick. They were not words in the ordinary sense. They behaved like instructions for a mouth. Vowels opened and closed in controlled progression. Front vowels shifted to back-rounded ones in repeatable patterns. Certain sequences could be pronounced with exact reversibility if timed to breath. A few resembled strings in the Greek magical papyri that scholars usually discussed with embarrassed caution, voces magicae, the so-called barbarous names, half borrowed from Egyptian, half degraded by copying, half protected by ritual prestige. Yes, that is three halves. That is how scholarship often feels from the inside. I emailed my advisor at 2:13 a.m., which in our department was either unprofessional or normal. Professor Miriam Edevane replied at 6:04 a.m. with two words. Come now. Her office occupied the corner of a building apparently designed by a committee of stern rectangles. Inside, however, it looked like a successful burglary at the British Museum. Tablet casts, facsimile papyri, a bronze mirror propped inexplicably beside a filing cabinet. Shelves of text editions annotated in a hand so compact it gave undergraduates migraines. She was in her 60s, sharp-faced, silver-haired, and dressed as if color were a moral concession. She took the printouts without greeting, read for perhaps 3 minutes, and said, "Where did you get these?" "I found a cult." Not helpful. "A prospective cult, then." That earned me a brief look of professional disappointment. She circled a line, then another, then pushed the sheets flat with both hands. "These are not names," she said. "That was my impression." "No, that was your hope. Different pathology." She tapped one of the strings. "Open front, mid-front, back-rounded, close on breath, reverse. This is articulatory sequencing." "For chant?" "For resonance." I had been prepared for skepticism, mockery, or at best, tolerant indulgence. What I had not prepared for was that immediate grave interest scholars get when something ridiculous becomes briefly useful. "Late ritual materials preserve this sort of thing," she said. "Not commonly, but enough. The problem is later copyists protect the exotic syllables more carefully than the explanatory frame, meaning decays. Procedure remains. It happens all the time in liturgy, less often where people admit it." She leaned back. "If these are authentic documents from a modern group, then either someone is staging a remarkably informed fraud, or they have independently reconstructed mouthroom coupling protocols that went half fossilized in late antique ritual transmission. That is either very exciting or very stupid. In my experience," she said, removing her glasses, "it is usually both." I told her in outline about Bay Area Voyagers. Not the whole thing, I was not yet ready to hear my own choices spoken back to me in plain daylight, but enough to produce the correct level of concern around the words analog, signal, and adjacent worlds. Professor Edevane listened without interruption. When I finished, she said, "This is Silicon Valley. It will be a scam." That was my baseline. It may also contain one fact. The region is very productive that way. She handed the pages back. If you continue, distinguish carefully between history and participation. One can accidentally become the other. The problem, naturally, was that Bay Area Voyagers became more interesting the longer I watched them. The weekly gatherings turned out to be a meticulously layered ecology of belonging. There were public talks, lab demos, reading circles on analog media theory, listening sessions in darkened rooms, volunteer restoration days for old equipment, and small group signal interpretation labs, where people sat around printouts and argued, with touching seriousness, about the difference between noise and invitation. Milo was always there, eager and sleepless, running cables or signing in guests or carrying trays of tea, as though hospitality itself were a research method. "You work here?" I asked him one evening while he adjusted levels on a reel deck. "Volunteer," he smiled. "For now." "For now?" "There are pathways. Technical track, facilitation track, field research track. It depends where you cohere." "Where you what?" "Cohere," he said slowly, as if I had missed the cleverness and not merely resented it. "Where your gifts stabilize." I had known Milo for all of 3 meetings and already wanted to protect him from language. Adrian gave me more transcripts. Lenora asked increasingly precise questions about my skills, schedule, financial flexibility, family location, and openness to immersive work environments, each couched in such benevolent professionalism that one almost forgot the categories involved. A local chapter coordinator from Seattle visited one night and spoke warmly about a global network of Voyager communities now operating in London, Osaka, Sao Paulo, Berlin, and Lagos. Their slides showed old radar domes, monastery-like retreat centers, restored phone exchanges, disused theaters, converted Cold War bunkers, and once, jarringly, a semiconductor clean room beside a caption about continuity-safe signal architecture. I began noticing other things too. The testimonials, the way they always emphasized prior dislocation. I used to feel like my curiosity had no home. No one had language for what I was sensing. At Bay Area Voyagers, I stopped feeling alone in the anomaly. It would have been manipulative even if it had not been sincere. One evening, after a demo in which a box of tubes and a projector lens produced a fleeting blob of light that the room politely pretended was revelation, Lenora asked whether I would consider a more formal role. "We're not recruiting followers," she said. "We're building translators." "That is a very well-calibrated sentence," she smiled. "People accuse any serious community of cultic aesthetics these days, usually because commitment embarrasses them. Commitment also bankrupts people historically." "In bad systems," she said. "We're building a good one." That was my first real glimpse of the steel under her charm. Adrian wanted belief because he needed witnesses. Lenora wanted structure because she needed yield. At home, the sequences kept getting stranger. One set matched an Akkadian incantation opening badly preserved in a Hellenistic hand. Another resembled a late Coptic hymn, only if you ignored meaning and mapped breath timing instead. A third turned out to be pronounceable only in a room with strong reflective surfaces, unless one had inhuman lungs or poor judgment. It started to seem possible, embarrassingly possible, that some ancient so-called magical materials had preserved acoustic procedures the people copying them no longer understood, which frankly would have been very on brand for history. I told myself I was collecting evidence for a paper. Then Milo texted me on a Sunday. "You free tonight? Adrian wants you in the archive lab. We got a new signal layer." The message carried the casual excitement of a friend inviting me to trivia. I went, because of course I did. Part 4. The Offshoot. The beginning of the end, like many things in modern life, arrived in the form of a slide deck. I saw it by accident, which is to say because Bay Area Voyagers had begun underestimating how much time scholars spend reading documents not intended for them. Adrian had asked me to compare a new phonetic layer against a late antique handbook of Voces Magicae. While waiting in the archive room for him to unlock a cabinet, I noticed a laptop open on a side table with a presentation paused mid-transition. The title on the slide read, "Voyager Communities as Pre-Technical Affinity Spaces." The bullet points beneath it were enough to turn my curiosity from romantic to forensic. Cultivate belonging through shared anomaly. Identify specialized skills through volunteer participation. Route high-coherence individuals into parallax research. Develop contribution pathways. Labor/data/capital/social network. Preserve doctrinal flexibility across demographic clusters. There are phrases so revealing one feels indecent simply reading them. Parallax research? I copied the slide title into my notebook just before the screensaver kicked in. Later that week, under the pretense of helping Milo organize archive labels, I learned that Bay Area Voyagers was not the whole entity. It was a chapter, or perhaps a wrapper. The invoices on a printer tray referenced Parallax Network, Asterion Analog, and a non-profit called the Continuity Institute. International wire transfers had descriptions like equipment restoration services and field culture support. One donation receipt mentioned mission-aligned capital pools with the kind of serene confidence only lawyers and cults achieve. Milo found me staring too long at a binder tab. "You're doing that face," he said. "What face?" "The one where you realize this is either much bigger or much worse." "That is an excellent description of most things in the Bay Area." He laughed, then stopped when he saw I wasn't fully joking. "Look," he said, lowering his voice, "I know some of it is, structured. But if you'd heard what I heard in the first few sessions, it, what did you hear? He hesitated in a way that told me the answer mattered. A room, he said. Behind the room we were in. That was the sort of statement one could interpret psychologically, spiritually, or acoustically, depending on how much sleep one had, and whether one had ever translated a curse tablet at midnight. I should have let it pass. Instead, I asked, "Did they ask you for money?" He stared at the floor, then too quickly, "Not like that." Which meant yes, like that. It took me another 3 days to find Nia Rahman. Or rather, for Nia to decide I had stumbled close enough to something worth intercepting. She emailed from an address that looked personal rather than institutional and contained exactly one sentence. If you've started noticing the cap table under the cosmology, meet me at the repair shop on Alma at 7. The repair shop turned out not to be a shop, but a long garage behind a narrow bungalow, packed with oscilloscopes, soldering stations, parts bins, old tape machines, open chassis, and 3 generations of technology in various states of indignation. A bicycle hung from the rafters like a failed design concept. A kettle whistled somewhere amid the wires. Nia herself was in her 30s, compact, dark-haired, wearing a grey sweatshirt and safety glasses on her head. She had the focused alertness of a person who trusted systems only after personally humiliating them. "You're late," she said. "It's 7:02. "Exactly." She pushed a mug of coffee toward me and pulled up a folder on an old monitor. "I was lead systems engineer on one of Adrian's signal teams for 11 months, she said. "I left when I realized Lenora wasn't building a research consortium. She was building an intake architecture." On the screen were slides from what looked like an internal parallax deck. One header read, "Meaning increases lifetime value." Another, "Asset fluidity indicators." Another, "Mission coherence index." I stared. She kept clicking. There it all was, the spiritual acquisition arm, the technical acquisition arm, the capital acquisition arm. Bay Area Voyagers and its sister chapters served as low-barrier front doors for the curious, lonely, brilliant, disaffected, indebted, and spiritually undernourished. Participants were scored for skills, relational isolation, contribution capacity, family wealth, inheritance horizon, and ideological pliability. Some were routed toward unpaid labor-restoring equipment for Asterian analog, some toward donor circles, some toward staff. A few, selected for technical value and psychological suggestibility, were advanced into deeper parallax research. "It's a cult," I said. "It's a cult with procurement software," Nia said. "More scalable." "Why are you showing me this?" "Because you're the kind of person they're built for. High specialization, low market arrogance, poor sleep hygiene, romantic relationship to dead texts. Catnip. I dislike being measurable. You should have avoided organizations." She leaned back. "I left before I had enough proof to damage them. You may be stupid enough to get me the rest." I appreciate the confidence. It isn't confidence, it's pattern recognition. She zoomed in on a spreadsheet. "Here's Bay Area Voyagers, local chapter, monthly events, volunteer funnels, training cohorts. Here's how those feed Asterian restoration labor. Here's how Asterian books the refurbished equipment as assets. Here's how Parallax Signal Labs collateralizes those assets. Here's how the non-profit side launders the vibe with grants and culture language." Launders the vibe is still, I think, one of the best phrases anyone has ever used in my presence. "Is any of the signal real?" I asked. Nia was quiet for a moment. "That's the problem," she said. "Some of it might be. A person can forgive a simple fraud. What ruins sleep is when falsehood shelters one stubborn fact." I told her about the phonetic sequences and Professor Edavane's reaction. Nia listened without mockery, which made it worse. "Okay," she said. "Then we separate layers. The cultic exploitation, probably real. The corporate pipeline, definitely real. The signal, possibly real. Adrian may be sincere. Lenora, absolutely predatory. Those categories are not comforting. Engineering rarely is. Before I left, she handed me a burner phone and a page of instructions for documenting internal materials without getting caught. It read like field notes for a dissertation on malice. At the door, she said, "They'll invite you deeper soon." How do you know? Because you're useful, and because they like recruiting through significance. I laughed, despite myself. That sounds like a chapter title. It's an acquisition strategy. The invite arrived the next morning. Phase Practice Weekend. Pacific Site 4. For candidates prepared to move from curiosity into alignment. At the bottom, in tasteful silver text, commitment confirms signal integrity. Milo texted 2 minutes later. "You got one too?" Then, "I'm going. This feels important." I sat on the edge of my bed and stared at the message until it blurred. Then I forwarded it to Nia. Her reply came back in 10 seconds. "Go, and don't drink anything that smells ceremonial." Part 5, Pacific Site 4. Pacific Site 4 occupied a former radar installation south of Half Moon Bay, where the land rose in wind-stung bluffs over the Pacific, and old concrete structures sat facing weather like retired fortifications that had found religion. The road wound through cypress and ice plant before opening abruptly onto low buildings painted in subdued mineral tones, meant, I think, to suggest both discretion and destiny. Someone in Parallax had spent a great deal of money making military ruin feel spiritually premium. The dormitory rooms were spare but expensive. Wool blankets, ceramic cups, matte black reading lamps, no visible televisions, no clocks. In the main hall, a ring of restored analog equipment sat under amber lighting like ceremonial instruments in a modernist chapel. Vacuum tubes glowed behind glass. Polished reels turned lazily on display decks. One wall bore a slogan in white letters tall enough to command, "Continuity is hospitality." 50 people attended the retreat. Recruits from Bay Area Voyagers, plus invitees from other chapters. The organ restoration woman from Redwood City, a pair of Latvian brothers who had inherited a warehouse of radio parts and, apparently, a susceptibility to cosmic franchising. A dentist from Marin who kept saying quantum empathy with the confidence of a man who had never been corrected in childhood. Milo, bright-eyed and drawn, already acting like belonging had improved his posture. Phones were surrendered on arrival. Lenora moved through the site like an event planner who had won an argument with God. Adrian gave the morning sessions. Technical talks on ambiguity, continuity media, phase drift, and the failure of digital systems to preserve weak interstitial correlations. He was careful, almost scrupulous in those rooms. He drew block diagrams. He discussed optical sound heads, selenium photocells, tube preamp non-linearities, free-running delay paths, unsynchronized oscillators, and why error correction might destroy the very ambiguities required for a low-bandwidth cross-branch signal to remain intact. If he had been lying in those moments, he was either brilliant or doomed. Lenora ran the evenings. She called them alignment sessions, which had the cheerful menace of corporate language laundered through mysticism. There were listening vigils in darkened rooms, paired disclosure exercises, controlled silence meals, mirror tasks, coherence walks along the cliff trails, and small group circles in which people were invited, never pressed, that was part of the elegance, to reveal the previous structures that had failed to hold their lives. The effect was not crude. That was what made it dangerous. No one shouted, no one threatened, no one said we are the only truth. They did something subtler. They created an environment in which every prior isolation looked like preparation and every fresh dependency could be narrated as arrival. On the second morning, we were led into a former operations chamber whose walls had been lined with sheet metal and whose ceiling now held a grid of suspended resonators. At the far end stood a version of the blue machine from the poster, not toy-like now, but functional-looking, its central optic ring nested inside a framework of tubes, mirrors, and brass housings. Adrian stood beside an oscilloscope. "We're not invoking anything," he said. We're testing whether certain vocal sequences stabilize the anomaly in coupled space. He looked straight at me. Ancient languages first. I was too vain not to comply. I spoke a Greek vowel ladder used in late ritual material. Nothing dramatic happened beyond the ordinary strange intimacy of hearing old syllables amplified in a metal room. Then I read one of the reconstructed non-semantic strings from the transcripts, timing the breath as Professor Edevane had suggested. The scope trace sharpened. A few people gasped. I hated them for it and hated myself because, despite every warning, part of me felt a flare of satisfaction so immediate and stupid it should have disqualified me from adulthood. We repeated the test with other speakers. Most produced only noise or brief partial harmonics. When I returned to a mixed Greek-Akkadian sequence from one of the stranger manuscripts I'd been working on, the stabilization recurred, brief, unstable, but there. Afterward, Adrian took me aside. "You see why we need your field," he said. "No," I said. "I see why you need an excuse." He smiled very faintly. "Those are not mutually exclusive." By the second night, the darker structures became harder to ignore. Sleep was limited, not brutally, but enough. Meals were light. Social contact narrowed. Doubt was welcomed, but only as a prelude to guided reframing. People who confessed confusion were praised for sensitivity. People who confessed longing were praised for courage. People who hesitated were asked, gently and repeatedly, what old fear preferred to remain untranslated. Lenora never pushed. She directed. During one circle, Milo spoke, voice shaking, about how invisible he had felt before joining Bay Area Voyagers, how technical environments always made him feel adjacent but not admitted, how here, for the first time, his curiosity seemed useful rather than embarrassing. Lenora inclined her head as though receiving a confidence at court. "You were not invisible," she said softly. "You were untranslated." The room breathed with that line. It was devastatingly effective. Human beings will forgive almost any structure if it tells them their loneliness was preparation rather than waste. Later that night, during a listening vigil in a room lit only by CRT glow and the phosphor drift of old oscilloscopes, the dentist's sister, Clara, I had learned, began trembling, then laughing, then insisting that someone in another room was speaking through the walls. Adrian killed the signal. Lenora crossed the room instantly. "What do you hear?" she asked. Clara looked at her with eyes too wide to trust. "A second auditorium," she whispered. "Behind this one." No one else spoke. Lenora took her out with 2 staff members. She returned 20 minutes later alone, calm as a finished spreadsheet. The next morning, Clara was gone. No one explained where. That afternoon, while the others were on a field coherence walk along the cliffs, I followed a corridor behind the equipment room and found an office. Lenora's desk was immaculate. The walls were not. A glass board held columns under headings that made my stomach drop even before I fully read them. Mission coherence, relational isolation, asset liquidity, inheritance horizon, conversion, pathway, labor/donor/recruit/staff. Pinned nearby was a world map with red thread connecting sites in California, Berlin, Osaka, Sao Paulo, Lagos, Tallinn, and somewhere in rural Scotland that no doubt had once been a monastery and now hosted overpriced revelation. A folder in a drawer contained donation commitments, intake reports, volunteer-to-staff transition templates, and several labeled magnetic reels. One tag in Adrian's hand read, "Original Anomaly/University Avenue/Optical Chain." I slid it into my bag. "You've chosen a disappointing method of inquiry." I turned so fast I cracked my hip against the desk. Adrian stood in the doorway. For a second, I thought he would call staff. Instead, he stepped inside and closed the door behind him. "You should call the police," I said. "And tell them what?" he asked quietly. "That a multinational shell structure used seeker communities to finance unclassifiable research. They'll prosecute the shells and miss the signal." "That doesn't excuse this." "No," he said. "It doesn't." He looked tired in the flat office light, the charismatic edge reduced to something closer to illness. I found the first stable anomaly in the optical sound system of a carbon arc projector on University Avenue 17 years ago, he said. We were restoring a damaged reel. Silent leader on the feed. The sound head should have given us nothing but floor noise. Instead, we got structure, then image residue, then instructions. He paused. I took it to universities, labs, archivists, physicists, media historians. No one wanted the career risk, so I built Parallax. And Lenora built the cult. A flicker in his face. Pain, annoyance, acknowledgement. Lenora built the intake structure, using people. Yes. Knowing they were vulnerable. Yes. That was the first honest thing he had said that day. Then, after a moment, he added, No grant committee funds a hole in reality, Elias, but lonely people and venture capitalists will. It was such a vile sentence and such a true one that for a second I had nothing to say. I'm leaving, I said. Yes, he said, you are. His gaze dropped to my bag. Take the reel, he said. I stared at him. You were always going to. Why let me? Because if Lenora gets ahead of this, she'll bury the anomaly under 3 more layers of business hygiene. And because if you're right about the linguistic layer, you may be the only person in the building who still recognizes evidence when it arrives badly dressed. He opened the door, then hesitated. One warning, he said without turning. If the witness resolves, if you ever see it clearly, do not assume it's on our side. He left me there with the reel in my bag and the ocean hammering the bluff outside like a machine too large for the building. That evening I found Milo by the seawall staring into fog. I don't think Clara went home, he said. No, I said. He nodded once, not as though he agreed, but as though he had crossed a line inside himself and knew it. The Pacific below us sounded like static being torn in two. Part 6, Felix Kessler's Notebook. Nia did not greet me when I arrived back from the coast. She looked at my face, held out a mug, and said, You got something. I put the reel on her workbench beside the copied intake sheets and whiteboard photos. The garage smelled of solder, coffee, and the comforting hostility of old electronics. Good, she said. I was getting tired of being right in theory. By midnight, the financial documents were spread in folders across her work table, and the reel sat under a lamp like contraband from a better century. She worked with the cold enjoyment of a person dismantling a machine built by someone she disliked. She's done this before, Nia said of Lenora after 20 minutes with the ledgers. Look at the routing. Donations into non-profit front. Service fees into events LLC. Volunteer labor into Asterion Analog. Asterion books assets. Assets collateralize debt. Debt finances expansion. Members think they're opening the multiverse. They're restoring inventory. That line may get you a byline in a lawsuit. It'll look good on a mug. For the byline, we needed June Kwan. June had been 2 years above me at Stanford and had sensibly defected from academia after concluding that historians eroticize poverty too much to be trusted with institutions. She became an investigative journalist with a gift for turning executive euphemism back into English. When I called and said I might have a global quasi-spiritual hardware cult laundering volunteers through shell entities, she said, Palo Alto again, in the weary tone of a doctor hearing that a chronic patient had resumed smoking. She agreed to review the financial material on one condition. No aliens in the first piece, she said. Fraud first, cosmic adjacency later, if ever. That left Nia and me with the reel. She built the cleanest dirty signal chain I have ever seen. Restored tape deck, tube preamp, passive filters, optical reader assembly scavenged from an old educational projector. No analog to digital conversion anywhere. No laptop, no software, just wire, light, drift, gain, and the sort of patience civilization once ran on. The first pass sounded like what most haunted media sound like. Hiss, low hum, intermittent tonal grit, the ordinary embarrassments of old systems. Then Nia altered the bias, adjusted head pressure, rebalanced the preamp, and the sound changed. The noise acquired internal scaffolding, not speech. structure, then faintly an image packet. It lasted less than a second, but it was enough. On a small monitor fed from the optical side of the chain, a blurred form bloomed and vanished in amber wash. Nia replayed it 3 times. That, she said, is annoyingly person-shaped. I hated how much relief I felt hearing that. Don't look pleased, she said. This does not improve your life. We isolated the packet further. Alongside the image was a set of timing clusters that matched the breath-based phonetic structures Professor Edevane had identified. When I voiced one of the simpler vowel ladders into the room while Nia adjusted the gain, the trace sharpened very slightly. She stopped the tape. No, she said. What? That shouldn't help that much. Ancient people liked participatory media. She looked at me over the rim of her mug. That is the most humanities sentence ever spoken in this garage. The next morning we went to the theatre. Its real name was the Orpheum, though everyone on University Avenue just called it the Old Theatre, as though age and function were sufficient identity. The projectionist, Oz Bloom, was in his 60s and dressed as if the 20th century had offered him several good options, and he saw no reason to let it leave. He wore a waistcoat, fingerless gloves, and the patient disdain of a man who knew digital projection had won commercially and remained, despite this, aesthetically vulgar. When I introduced myself as the language guy from the weird poster people, he nodded as if that solved a small mystery. Thought so, he said. You have the posture. The posture of what? Someone who has read too many dead things and still expects an answer. He let us into the booth. It smelled exactly as a projection booth should. Hot metal, dust, oil, aging wiring, and cellulose memory. The main projector housings rose out of the gloom like black mechanical altars. A soundhead assembly sat below one of them, modest and precise, as though embarrassed to be implicated in cosmology. Oz ran a hand over the casing. This one started talking when it shouldn't, he said. He told us Adrian had rented booth access over the past year under the pretense of archival sound calibration. Long nights, strange optical inserts, extra amplification stages. Once, near 2 a.m, Oz had heard a second soundtrack beneath a reel leader that should have contained nothing but blank optical noise. Like voices? I asked. He shrugged. Like a room that didn't belong to us. From a locked cupboard, he produced an old maintenance log and a narrow brass key taped to the inside cover. Previous projectionist kept notes, he said. Felix Kessler, loved Greek, distrusted state power, died of being 82 and impossible. If Adrian was smart, he learned half his tricks from Felix and called them innovation. The key opened a flat locker behind stacked lens cases. Inside were 3 film cans, 2 notebooks, a wrapped bronze hand mirror, and a folder of contact sheets. My fingers went cold before I touched any of it. Felix Kessler's notebooks were written in a tight, disciplined hand, half technical log and half private heresy. English alternated with Greek transliteration, occasional clumsy Akkadian signs, diagrams of optical chains, room sketches, vowel ladders, and furious underlinings. On one page, the barbarous names are not names, they are filters. On another, voice plus room plus uncounted light. And on a third, shakier later, do not sample. Maintain continuity. The others arrive in drift. At the bottom of one film can was a sketch of a device. Not exactly the blue console from the poster, but unmistakably its ancestor. Felix had drawn a projector soundhead, delay path, and optical viewport simplified into icon. The console image, I realized, was not merely branding, it was a diagram disguised as nostalgic illustration. Professor Edevane read photocopies of Felix's pages with such intensity, I worried briefly for the paper. Of course, she said at last, in the furious tone scholars reserve for history when it has behaved in a way they find rude. If practical acoustic procedures were embedded in ritual performance language, later copyists would preserve the sacred syllables and lose the theory, meaning rots first. Form lingers. She circled a note in Felix's hand, front open / background / reverse on breath. This is not mysticism in the childish sense, she said. It is embodied signal shaping. That sounds like mysticism with better Grant language. It usually is. June came by that evening, reviewed the financial documents, and whistled once without joy. This is publishable, she said. Global shell structure, donor routing, volunteer labor disguised as mission participation, possible unregistered investment solicitation, psychological scoring if I can corroborate. Did they really track inheritance horizon? Yes. How 1930s of them. She looked at the real note, the Felix pages, the sketch of the blue machine. And the signal part? Complicated, I said. Good, it can wait. The invitation to Convergence Night arrived the next morning. Grand demonstration at the Orpheum. Press, donors, chapter members, invited guests. Adrian would unveil the next stage of the Multiverse console. Lenora would announce a global expansion initiative for Voyager communities. June smiled when I forwarded it. Perfect, she said. Let them build the stage. Nia was less cheerful. Get me into the booth, she said, and whatever happens, do not let Lenora turn the collapse into a sermon. I looked at the poster from the theater again that night. The blurred creature at the bottom seemed no clearer than before. Still, there was something about the posture now that bothered me in a new way. Something almost familiar. I told myself I was tired. History, in fairness, had given me many reasons to distrust resemblance. Part 7. Convergence Night. Convergence Night arrived, with exactly the sort of cold, bright weather Palo Alto uses when it wants to look accidental in photographs. By dusk, the Orpheum marquee glowed over a line of attendees that mixed the curious, the converted, the wealthy, the professionally skeptical, and the ordinary Bay Area species that will attend anything if the typography is good enough and the possibility exists of being early to a future. Inside, enlarged versions of the blue poster hung in the lobby like devotional recruitment art. The console gleamed from every wall. Under one of them, Milo stood in a volunteer badge, handing out programs with the fixed smile of a man who had slept badly in a moral weather system. "You okay?" I asked. He looked at me and for a fraction of a second dropped the expression. "No," he said, "but I'm functioning. That is the Bay Area's preferred form of collapse." A real laugh, brief and grateful. Nia was already in the projection booth with an old 16mm projector, a custom audio path, and enough parallax documentation to make several attorneys rich. June's article was scheduled to publish at 8:17 p.m. sharp. Professor Edevane, to my surprise, had accepted my invitation and now sat 3 rows from the back wearing the expression of a Roman augur attending a shareholder meeting. I was on the program as consulting philologist, first-layer contact interpretation. There are moments in life when one becomes professionally grateful for obscurity because it means one can go on stage at a cult event without too many relatives hearing about it later. At 7:52, the house lights dimmed. Lenora took the stage first. She was magnificent in the way hurricanes are magnificent when viewed from somewhere temporarily insured. Black silk, discreet microphone, composure honed to molecular precision. Behind her, the curtain rose on the newest Multiverse console, a larger, more elegant evolution of the blue device, now integrated with projector optics, tube amplification, and an impossible amount of brushed metal confidence. She spoke without haste, about uncertainty, about civilization's tragic decision to confuse measurement with intimacy, about the poverty of digital culture, about old machines that had once listened differently, about communities of seekers and technicians and translators building a new global network for contact. She did not lie in any simple way. That was why she was good. Each statement contained enough truth to seduce and enough omission to weaponize. "We stand," she said, "at the edge of the most important communication event in human history. But no frontier survives without communities of courage. The Bay Area Voyagers and our sister chapters around the world have become living laboratories of mutual trust, technical devotion, and a new hospitality to the unknown. Mutual trust, technical devotion, hospitality. She could have sold indictments as heirlooms. Then she introduced me. I walked onto the stage carrying Felix Kessler's notebook in one hand and a folder of copied parallax documents in the other. From the audience, the theater looked like every theater I have ever loved. Dark, expectant, full of people who wanted light to tell them what mattered. It was the wrong room for a sermon and the perfect room for an exposure. The first thing to know, I said into the microphone, is that whatever else this signal may be, Bay Area Voyagers is not what it says it is. The air changed. You could feel the audience's shared nervous system contract. Lenora's face did not move. Adrian, standing near the console, closed his eyes for one brief second as if inevitability had finally reached the appointment. I kept going. I spoke about Parallax Network, Asterian Analog, the non-profit fronts, the routed donations, the volunteer restoration labor booked as assets, the intake scoring, the inheritance metrics, the contribution pathways. I described Bay Area Voyagers not as a research fellowship, but as a recruitment wrapper designed to identify specialized labor, donor potential, and technically useful believers. I quoted from their own slide deck. I projected, with Nia's help from the booth and the clatter of honest film, one of the internal slides 12 feet tall onto the screen above Lenora's head. Meaning increases lifetime value. That one did the work for me. A murmur moved through the room like weather. Then another slide. Voyager communities as pre-technical affinity spaces. Then the conversion pathways, labor, data, capital, social network. Someone in the fifth row stood up. Someone else swore. Milo at the aisle looked less shocked than sickened, which told me some part of him had already known. Lenora moved toward the lectern. This, she said, voice perfectly level, is what frontier work always looks like to those trapped in older categories. Fraud also looks like fraud, I said. That drew an ugly living sound from the audience, half laugh, half anger. Then Nia took over. Through the theater, speakers came 3 audio examples in sequence. First, one of Bay Area Voyagers' cultivated demonstration recordings, impressive, dramatic, thick with managed ambiguity. Second, a synthetic match constructed from ordinary sources and filters, close enough to show how easy such theater was to fake. Third, the original anomaly reel. Even frightened people could hear the difference. The room went still. At 8:17, phones began lighting up in the dark. June's article hit. You could watch people reading. Watch the language of betrayal settling into real time. Global shell structures, routed funds, labor exploitation, psychological scoring, property acquisitions. Lenora's beautifully humane vocabulary translated by journalism into the sort of nouns regulators prefer. It should have ended there, with chaos, reputational collapse, and the old blunt instruments of public shame. Instead, the house lights flickered. At first, I assumed Nia had cut something in the booth. Then the projector whine changed pitch in a way no digital system ever could, because no digital system ever carries disappointment in its throat quite so personally. Somewhere behind the stage, a relay snapped. The console's optic flared white. Adrian turned toward it with actual terror. No, he said, not to us, to the machine. The speakers filled with the real sound, not the curated one, not the staged one. The original layered hiss and tonal scaffolding from the anomaly reel, but magnified, coming now not only from the console, but from the theater itself, from the projector soundhead, from the amplifier racks, from the room. The old building had become part of the circuit. The screen went blank, then it went deep. There is no better word. It ceased to look like a surface receiving light, and began to look like an aperture through which another interior had agreed, reluctantly, to be seen. At first I thought it was some grotesque mirror of our own auditorium. Rows, volume, darkness, a gathered place. Then movement resolved. Not human. Not monstrous either, which would have been comforting in its familiarity. They were arranged around resonant structures that might have been instruments, consoles, or anatomical extensions. Translucent frames like glass learning to articulate, membrane fans pulsing color in harmonic ratios, dense nodes of opacity where attention seemed to collect. The nearest shape turned, if turning is the word, and three brightened regions locked onto our side with the unmistakable force of being observed by something organized. The house forgot language. Someone screamed. Someone laughed in the wrong register. A man in a navy blazer dropped his program and bolted. Two people in the front row simply stared, which I respected. Lenora backed away from the lectern for the first time since I met her. Adrian moved toward the machine. Of course he did. He reached me halfway and caught my forearm with astonishing strength. "The theater," he said, voice ragged. "It was here first." Then the transformer bank behind the stage blew. A white arc cracked through the console housing. The sound was less explosion than electrical betrayal. Adrian was thrown sideways. Tubes shattered. Curtain fabric caught. Smoke punched upward. For one impossible second, the other auditorium remained on the screen, the nearest being still watching us through bloom and sparks, as if this sort of thing had happened before in some parallel etiquette manual. Then the image collapsed into bands, then white, then nothing. After that, it was all animal labor, people shouting, ushers hauling open side exits. Milo pulling two older donors toward the lobby while swearing like a man discovering his theology had been underwritten by consultants. Nia, black with dust, coming down from the booth with an extinguisher. Professor Edivane helping someone who had tripped in the aisle because scholarship occasionally produces heroism by accident. When the fire crews arrived, the stage was smoking, the console was ruined, and Adrian Vale was dead beneath the machinery he had spent half his life trying to justify. Lenora Quist was gone. I found in the street under the emergency lights a small brass key in my palm. I did not remember picking it up. I only knew it was not mine. Part 8. Static after the fire. The world accepted the smallest explanation available with gratifying speed. Within 48 hours, the story had become familiar enough for headlines. Fraudulent spiritual tech network, global shell companies, manipulated volunteers, questionable fundraising, performance-based belief communities. Some outlets used the word cult, others, with tediously modern caution, preferred high-demand organization. No one wanted to lead with parallel intelligences when unregistered securities were available and easier to invoice. June's article detonated the structure nicely. More followed. State regulators suddenly discovered moral urgency once money was arranged in certain unlawful shapes. Asterion Analog's books became interesting to people who had never once considered vacuum tubes spiritually significant. International chapters began rebranding or disavowing headquarters with the speed of people fleeing a dinner bill. Milo gave a statement, then another. Clara reappeared through legal counsel and described coercive alignment interventions in language hard enough to cut through litigation strategy. 3 former chapter coordinators in Europe surfaced. Lenora remained missing. As for the impossible event at the theater, it dissolved almost instantly into public ambiguity. Electrical failure, some said, projection artifact, mass suggestion, stress, smoke, panic, visual distortion during transformer blowout. A few attendees insisted they had seen something impossible, but impossible testimony degrades quickly when surrounded by clear financial wrongdoing. The mind prefers the kind of evil it already has folders for. I was interviewed by police, journalists, and 2 people whose affiliations they did not volunteer, and whose shoes had the bureaucratic sturdiness of people accustomed to closed rooms. I told the truth selectively. Parallax's exploitation I described in detail. The screen event I rendered as a visual anomaly accompanying catastrophic equipment failure. This was not courage, but triage. Give institutions one impossible fact too early, and they will often neglect the merely criminal ones out of bureaucratic embarrassment. 3 nights after the fire, Oz let Nia and me back into the projection booth. "You both look terrible," he said. "Thank you." Nia replied. Correctly, I mean. The brass key opened a shallow steel drawer beneath the secondary sound rack. Inside were 2 pages torn from Felix Kessler's notebook, a narrow tin of hand-spliced optical leader, Adrian's field notes, and an envelope with my surname on it in Adrian's hand. Inside the envelope was a single sentence. Not radio, not faith, optics, breath, drift. Beneath it, a diagram, projector sound head, tube preamp, tape delay, room, human speaker, feedback path. No digital stages anywhere. Naya studied it for a long time. He was right about the architecture, she said finally. If the anomaly only stabilizes when weak correlations remain unresolved long enough for a biological perceptual system to lock onto them, digital chains would murder it. Hard clocking, quantization, error correction, premature classification. That sentence should not sound as ominous as it does. It sounds ominous because you're in it. Professor Edevane read Felix's remaining notes and Adrian's diagram the next day in her office. Of course, mirrors, bowls, caves, choirs, bronze resonators, water basins, all of it, she muttered. Ancient ritual tech wasn't primitive because it lacked our vocabulary. It was experimental under a different metaphysics. She pointed at a copied line. Front open / background / reverse on breath. Your so-called nonsense strings are performance constraints, stable articulatory patterns. They shape the vocal tract as part of the system. You say that like it's normal. I say everything like it's philology. That is how I cope. We laid out the hypothesis. The anomaly was not a signal in the radio sense. It was a low-bandwidth cross-branch coupling that required a peculiar chain of conditions to remain visible. Continuous optical modulation, drift-prone analog delay, certain non-linear amplification stages, a reflective room, and a human speaker whose mouth and auditory cortex functioned as an adaptive matched filter. Ancient materials had preserved shards of the required vocal procedures as incantations, sacred names, or barbarous syllables, because the procedures worked long after the theory had rotted away. Professor Edevane, to my lasting affection, did not laugh. Fine, she said. Prove it. That night in Nia's garage, between a cracked oscilloscope and a box of reel hubs, we made a list of what would be required for a clean attempt. The Orpheum soundhead, Felix's spliced leader, a functioning tube preamp, a free-running analog delay, passive filters, a dark empty theater, the phonetic sequences, and me. This is the part, Nia said, writing with a grease pencil on the back of a parallax donor intake form, where I remind you that participation remains a terrible methodology. History disagrees. History also burned a lot of herbs and made enemies with the sea. June came by once more before publication of her follow-up piece. I can keep pressure on the fraud story, she said. Lenora's route through the shell entities is getting clearer. There are property holds in Estonia, Delaware, and Singapore. Also, someone in Berlin enjoyed billing emotional manipulation as technical fellowship. Useful, Nia said. June looked at the diagram on the table. You're really doing this, then? We're really doing something inadvisable, I said. Whether this exists remains open. She studied me for a moment. Don't found a movement. That is oddly specific. It's the Bay Area, she said. Everybody thinks one genuine anomaly entitles them to a platform. When she left, the garage felt briefly normal, which was more disturbing than the alternative. Midnight found us back in the Orpheum, the lobby dark, the ticket booth empty, the theater seats waiting in rows like witnesses with good posture. Oz made bad coffee on a portable burner in the booth and said, "If anything comes through the screen, charge it full price. We're not a charity." Nia finished wiring the chain. The soundhead lamp glowed. The tape loop moved in soft, continuous travel. The tube preamp hummed with the low, disreputable confidence of old electronics that know they are still interesting. "Before we begin," she said, "I'd like the record to reflect that this is an irresponsible use of expertise." There is no record. Exactly. She dimmed the house lights. The theater settled around us. I took Felix's notebook in one hand and stood in front of the first row facing the screen, feeling every bad decision in my academic life stand up and applaud. Part 9. A Theory of Incantation. The first thing that happened was nothing. This is important because people who describe the impossible tend to edit out the minutes in which nothing happens, and everyone feels foolish. Those minutes are the moral spine of any good experiment. Without them, revelation becomes theater. Nia rolled the spliced leader through the projector head without film. The optical sound system murmured. The tape loop returned a wash of hiss and low-frequency grain. A trace bloomed uncertainly on the oscilloscope in the booth, and then subsided into the sort of noisy indifference old systems produce when asked to impersonate cosmology. "Good," Nia called down. "That means it's still humiliating us honestly." I opened Felix's notebook. The first sequence was simple, a ladder of vowels arranged not for meaning but for shape. Open front, close front, rounded back, reverse. I spoke them at conversational volume. The room accepted them, reflected them, gave them back thinly altered, nothing else. The second sequence came from a damaged Greek papyrus copied in the 4th century by someone who clearly understood reverence better than phonetics. Professor Edivane's reconstruction notes sat in the margin of my printout like an impatient ghost. I spoke that one too. The hiss thickened, not loudly, not dramatically, but the way a room changes when one realizes the conversation in it has gained a third participant. Nia adjusted the gain by a fraction. "Again," she said. I did it again. The projector light across the screen acquired a fine internal grain that was not present in the optical path alone. The tape delay returned the vowels altered, not by echo exactly, but by some subtle reweighting of their internal balance. There are times when acoustic phenomena become unnervingly easy to anthropomorphize. This was one. The system no longer sounded passive, it sounded attentive. We added the next layer, one of the more notorious so-called barbarous strings from late magical sources, a line students either loved for its flamboyant nonsense or hated for its refusal to pass. Spoken semantically, it meant nothing. Spoken according to Felix's breath marks, it moved the mouth through a pattern of cavity shifts that made anatomical sense even before the room responded. The trace on the scope sharpened. Naya came down from the booth carrying a flashlight and the kind of expression engineers wear when faced with evidence that the world has not read the same textbooks. "That shouldn't be doing that," she said. On the positive side, I said, "Your evening is getting worse." "Keep speaking," I went on. The sequences stopped feeling like recitation and began feeling like a set of gestures performed by the mouth, chest, and palate in relation to the room. Some opened resonance. Some constricted it. Some forced the breath to break in ways that made ordinary speech awkward, but the returning tone easier to hold. The ancient materials had not preserved language. They had preserved a choreography. On the fifth sequence, the screen brightened, not with more lumens, but with agreement. The only honest word is that it seemed less illuminated than more willing to behave as a surface of exchange. Depth gathered in it the way storm gathers in sky, not appearing all at once but becoming undeniable after the fact. I heard Nia whisper something unprintable behind me. The sound in the room changed again. Alongside the hiss and tone, there now came intermittent clusters, structured in timing, not unlike the anomaly reel, but cleaner. The auditory cortex, that vain and over-helpful organ, began offering interpretations before I had asked for any. I ignored them and kept to the notebook. At a line Professor Edivane had labeled reversible under controlled breath only, the screen deepened sharply. For one instant, I thought we were simply seeing our own theater reflected badly. Then the geometry diverged. There was another auditorium, or rather, an approximation of one shaped by whatever minimum common architecture two adjacent realities required to hold an exchange. Space, tiers, apertures, shadow, the comfortingly familiar skeleton of a gathered place, adapted across difference. Beyond that first negotiated frame, their world resolved in layers. I have searched since for comparisons that do not cheapen it. Imagine organ pipes bred from translucent cartilage. Imagine cuttlefish redesigned by an architect who understood optics better than water. Imagine membranes, veils, struts, and denser nodes arranged in asymmetries that became new symmetries as they moved. Colors did not sit on their surfaces. Colors behaved as if they were part of the being's reasoning. Pulses of opal blue, amber, blood orange, and ultraviolet adjacent glimmer flowed across them in ratios too precise to call decorative and too expressive to call mechanical. Around them stood structures that were obviously technological yet utterly free of our digital fetish for discrete states. Liquid lens arrays, optical shutters, resonant chambers, reeds submerged in vapor, surfaces whose transparency varied continuously with unseen pressure. Old school, if your school had evolved on another branch of reality and made peace with ambiguity. The nearest being, or cluster, or person, since grammar becomes provincial quickly in such moments, moved closer to the aperture. 3 brighter regions fixed on me whenever I changed pitch. I understood them provisionally as eyes. Nia came to stand beside me. Her voice, when it arrived, was stripped of almost everything except engineering. "Do not stop," she said. "I wasn't planning to." "Good, because I currently hate being right." I kept the reversible line moving. The tones returning from their side began to correlate more strongly with the shapes my mouth was making. Then, with that eerie modesty all great impossibilities share, the communication started not as speech, but as correspondence. Image bundles, ratios, conceptual clusters attached to tone envelopes. Not language translated word for word, but mutual scaffolding. The first stable exchange came with an image of layered transparencies slightly misregistered, adjacent, not starside, then an image of 2 rooms sharing some volumes but not all, neighbors, not above. The next cluster struck Nia visibly harder than it did me. Old projection systems, wire recorders, bronze mirrors, water basins, tape loops, choir lofts, stone chambers, a hand over a resonant bowl, a cave mouth, a reel passing through a sound head. Old devices here because they drift. Your counting engines decide too early. Nia laughed once, helplessly, the sound of a woman vindicated by beings she did not wish to impress. Another cluster. We have spoken through bronze, water, stone, wire, film, storm, tape. Your ancestors preserved procedures and made myths around the rest. I thought of the Greek magical papyri, of ritual handbooks, of monks and magicians copying strings of vowels because those strings had once worked in rooms like these. History tilted under me. An entire field of scholarship became, in a moment, more embarrassing and more useful. The nearest being pulsed an image sequence, a bronze mirror in lamplight, a lead curse tablet, a church choir beneath a vault, Felix Kessler in a projection booth, Adrian receiving the first packet, Lenora before a wall of metrics, money moving through colored channels, Milo hanging posters, Clara in the listening room, the blue console, the audience at Convergence night. Then a conceptual cluster so clean it needed no translation. Misused. "Yes," I said aloud before remembering speech was almost ornamental. The being brightened, if not assent, then recognition. I asked carefully through the sequences and whatever ragged interface our voices now provided, the question every civilization seems to believe it would ask nobly until the opportunity actually arises. "What do you want?" The answer took longer. Not conquest, not rescue, not worship. None of the primate melodramas we habitually attach to contact. What they wanted was continuity. Their branch, as best we could understand, had learned long ago that highly synchronized, overcorrected communication infrastructures progressively erased the ambiguous weak couplings through which adjacent realities could exchange anything at all. Not because digital systems were evil in the cultic sense Adrian and Lenora sometimes implied, but because hard-timed, error-corrected, classification-heavy systems optimized against exactly the drift and unresolved correlation cross-branch contact required. analog refugees, free-running optical systems, continuous media, and biological perception preserved windows. They had tried for centuries of our time to keep those windows alive by seeding workable fragments into cultures that could preserve them. Ritual practices, vocal strings, resonant architectures, mirror operations, sound devices. Most attempts decayed into religion, fraud, or folklore. Some yielded moments of real contact. Felix had one. Adrian had another. We had this. One final image bundle settled into place with extraordinary clarity. A dark room, a single projector lamp, a human mouth speaking into ambiguity, a network map not of corporations but of rooms. Keep one room uncounted, keep one light continuous, keep one mouth willing to learn. I wish I could say I responded with solemn grace. Instead, I said, "That is an unreasonable amount of responsibility for a graduate student." To my astonishment, the nearest being produced a rapid shimmer of small color pulses that felt unmistakably like amusement. Nia beside me muttered, "Great, you've become legible internationally." Then the next sequence arrived, the poster, the Polaroid, the blurred creature, the note. Adrian at the theater years earlier, receiving the first packet. Me on University Avenue, pausing before the poster case in the rain. And in the conceptual bridge between them, witness. Nia went utterly still. "Oh no!" she said. The being adjusted the image, sharpening the blurred figure 1 degree, one shoulder slightly higher than the other. Head tilted at the angle I assume whenever I am reading something I distrust but cannot ignore. My own silhouette stared back at me across the impossible. For a few seconds I forgot every language I knew. Part 10. The Witness. There are revelations that enlarge the soul and revelations that merely reorganize your embarrassment. This one was the second kind. "The creature," Nia said carefully, "appears to be you." "Don't say it like that. How else should I say it? Preferably with less of the word creature." The being closest to the aperture pulsed a new sequence of images, not just the poster, a chain, the convergence night disaster, the stage blast, me moving in front of the screen, the aperture opening wider from their side than ours, a capture of my outline against the light. Then Adrian, years earlier, receiving a weak image packet that contained the blurred witness. Then Bay Area Voyagers printing posters asking the public to help identify the figure. Low bandwidth leakage, temporal shear. The branches apparently did not align perfectly in time. Nia understood before I did because engineers are faster than philologists when the universe behaves like a badly documented system. "The coupling doesn't just cross phase," she said. "It crosses offset time. Small shear, unstable but non-zero. Their later observation can arrive here earlier if the path holds." I stared at the image of my own profile. That is a ridiculous sentence. It's also the cleanest explanation you're likely to get. The being sent another conceptual diagram, two waveforms offset not only in phase but along a time axis. The overlap window slanted. Under certain drift conditions, packets could leak upstream relative to one branch and downstream relative to another. The witness was me, not chosen, not foretold, captured. I was the thing Bay Area Voyagers had spent years trying, under various fraudulent and sincere pretexts, to identify. Adrian had not merely believed in the anomaly. He had been hunting the blurred figure inside it, because the first packet had told him, accurately if incompletely, that whoever found the witness would be able to unlock the multiverse. Which is exactly the sort of phrase a desperate founder would interpret badly and a marketer would optimize immediately. The beings pulsed again. This time the bridge was clear enough to render almost as syntax. Find witness. Build room. Maintain continuity. Send image. Preserve path. The loop. I looked at Nia. She was already thinking at uncomfortable speed. "If Adrian's first packet depended on your later capture," she said, "and your being recruited depended on the poster generated from that packet, then yes. It's a causal loop or a self-consistent branch structure, or the universe has a truly offensive sense of humor." "None of those help," No one promised help. The aperture flickered. The being's colors dimmed, then brightened again with effort. The coupling was weakening. Another packet came through, the blue machine image, overlaid now with corrections. It had never been a finished device. It was an iconographic compression of the actual chain: projector sound head, optical path, delay loop, room coupling, vocal input, viewing aperture. Adrian and Lenora had interpreted it as a brandable artifact and built a console around it. The underlying diagram was real. The product mythology was parasitic. Naya exhaled sharply. So the poster was instructions. Yes, I said, disguised as recruitment. Which, to be fair, is still how half technology works. More images. Lenora at the stage. Donation flows, retreats, metrics, world map. Then the nearest being pulsed a color sequence that carried the closest thing yet to moral judgment. Parasitic structure on valid path. That is the best definition of cult I've heard in years, I said. Nia glanced at me. Focus, cryptid. I looked back at the screen. Did you just call me cryptid? You're a blurred creature on a poster. We're all doing our best. The aperture shivered again. A final imperative bundle pushed through. Send image now. Earlier recipient waiting. Window narrows if unsent. Can we even do that? I asked. Nia had already crossed to the booth stairs. With the right optical modulation path, maybe. The packet doesn't need narrative richness. It only needs enough to reproduce the lure Adrian first saw, and enough detail to keep the branch self-consistent. I hated how reasonable that sounded. The old theatre seemed suddenly full of my own footsteps in advance. Between Felix's sketch, Adrian's notes, the cult's archived poster assets, and the being's corrective overlays, we had what we needed to reconstruct the originating packet, or enough of it, the image of the blue console, the Polaroid blur, the note. I took a step back. No! Naya was already patching a side chain with the efficiency of a paramedic working on fate. No what? I am not writing this creature. She looked at me for 1 second, then back at the patch bay. From their side, you are a half-resolved mammal made of light leak and posture. Creature is charitable. That is not helping. Would you prefer entity? It sounds taxable. The nearest being emitted another faint shimmer that again felt suspiciously like amusement. I had spent years studying how ritual traditions preserve procedures without understanding them. I had not expected to become one. Nia fed a grayscale capture of the corrected console diagram through the optical chain. We added the blurred figure, then the text. I kept the original phrasing as closely as possible because my younger self, the fool, would recognize the balance of absurdity and specificity. It had caught me the first time. It would catch me again. At the bottom right, on a paper scrap in my own hand, I wrote, "This creature seems to know where to unlock the multiverse. We need to find it." I disliked every letter. "It has to look a little tacky," Nia said. "Otherwise you won't trust it." That is the cruelest thing anyone has ever correctly said about me. The beings brightened as the packet took shape, as though they were watching us rebuild a needed superstition. It occurred to me then that Adrian had not simply exploited the anomaly. He had been exploited by it too, in the smaller, sadder sense that every person who finds one true mystery is tempted to wrap it in manageable lies: a company, a movement, a set of paths, a donor model, a cult if necessary, anything to hold the unbearable fact that the universe had once addressed him and then refused to explain itself on schedule. I almost pitied him. Then I remembered the inheritance metrics and stopped. "Ready?" Nia asked. "Number." "Yes," I said. Part 11, the packet. There is a kind of stillness peculiar to old theatres after midnight, when no audience remains but the room itself has not stopped expecting light. We stood in that stillness surrounded by machinery, older than our current mistakes. Nia fed the packet into the modified optical path. The leader moved through the sound head. The tube stages warmed under load. The tape loop carried the returning structures just long enough for drift to do its necessary, imprecise work. On the screen, the poster formed, dissolved, reformed, then stretched in bands as if being negotiated by two incompatible filing systems. I resumed the vocal sequences, now less incantation than stabilizing protocol. Vowels open, background, reverse, hold breath at the turn, let the room answer. The aperture returned, not fully, enough. The other auditorium sharpened in steps. The nearest beings had gathered close. Behind them, their own apparatus glowed with continuous modulations I could not pass but had begun horribly to admire. The packet moved between us as both image and event. Their colors shifted in tight, excited ratios. If you had told me a year earlier that I would one day read alien body language as anxious encouragement, while sending a retro recruitment poster back in time through an optical sound chain, I would have recommended more sleep. Then the booth window beside us changed. It no longer showed the empty present night street outside the Orpheum. It showed rain, University Avenue earlier, wet pavement holding neon, a bike locked to the wrong signpost, the coffee shop still open, the theater poster case lit from within, and walking toward it, shoulders slightly forward against the weather, carrying a messenger bag and a paper cup, was me. Or the version of me who had not yet been recruited, betrayed, terrified, vindicated, and made technically responsible for maintaining continuity between adjacent civilizations. Younger by months rather than years, but innocence measures in much smaller units when it breaks. Nia said nothing. For once, there was no useful joke available. I watched myself slow. Even at that distance, even through whatever slanted overlap the branches allowed, I recognized the sequence of reactions. First, the small lift of amusement at the absurdity of the poster, then the stillness, then the lean forward as the phrasing struck something, then the head tilt. On the far side of our screen, the neighboring beings brightened in collective attention. They were watching the same moment from their side, though for them it may well have been archival, ceremonial, and current all at once. Nia modulated the gain by fingertips. "Hold the breath longer," she murmured. I did. The poster in our packet flared, then settled into the glass case on the other side of time. My earlier self read the note. I saw, with a horrifying intimacy, the exact second suspicion lost to curiosity. The part of me that noticed the translated cadence, the design logic, the diagram hidden in the toy-like machine, the Polaroid blur, the question mark, the rude little appeal to my vanity disguised as public service. The loop closed with the quiet vulgarity of software finally compiling. All at once I saw the entire chain, not as narrative but as structure. Adrian in the booth years earlier, receiving a packet sourced partly from a future event he did not yet understand. Adrian interpreting the icon as machine and the blur as mission. Lenora recognizing immediately that mission plus ambiguity plus technical glamour plus loneliness equals pipeline. The Bay Area Voyagers growing out of that misreading into a worldwide intake cult. Milo and Clara and the others drawn into the structure. Nia leaving. June exposing. Professor Edivane translating history back into use. The old theater remaining the one honest building in the story. And at the center, insultingly me. One badly resolved posture trapped in an image that had recruited its own source. No prophecy, no chosenness. Just a stable loop and a universe stingy with bandwidth. The aperture trembled, the nearest being lifted what I had come lazily to think of as an arm, though it was really a branching translucent structure threaded with color. A farewell, an acknowledgement, a continuation signal. Language remained inadequate and possibly impolite. One last conceptual bundle crossed. Not command this time, not even request, something closer to gratitude or mutual relief. Then the side window street darkened. The past withdrew. The packet was gone, delivered to the version of me about to ruin his own schedule. The other auditorium receded into depth, then grain, then the ordinary reflected light of the projection beam. The theater became a theater again. For a long minute, neither Nia nor I moved. Then she sat down on an overturned film can and said, "Well, yes," I said. That was obnoxiously real. I laughed then, not because anything was funny, but because the available alternatives were kneeling, screaming, or beginning a religion, and none of those seemed structurally sound. Nia rubbed both hands over her face and looked at the dead poster now frozen on the screen in its final harmlessness. "You realize," she said, "that Adrian's entire cult emerged from a badly interpreted support ticket. That is one way to describe the occult. And you," she added, "are now historically responsible for the phrase, 'this creature.' I intend to carry that shame with rigor." She stood, walked to the booth window, and looked out at the present street. "No movement," she said. "No cosmic encore, just Palo Alto. That may be the most unsettling part. We dismantled the chain only halfway, leaving enough intact for one more attempt if needed." The projector lamp cooled slowly. Dust turned in the dying beam. Somewhere in the lobby, Oz coughed and moved a stack of programs. When we finally stepped outside, dawn was beginning to grey the avenue. I looked across at the poster case where months earlier I'd first seen the call for Voyagers. It now held a poster for a midnight double feature of Invasion of the Body Snatchers and Seconds, which felt less like programming than commentary. "You okay?" Nia asked. "No," I said, "but I'm functioning." She glanced sideways at me. "That line sounded better on Milo." "That is because Milo has a moral soul and I have graduate training." She snorted. Then after a moment more quietly, "We can stop." I thought about that. About June's investigations. About Lenora somewhere still in the world, capable of building the same structure around a different anomaly. About Professor Edivane, who would sooner duel a dean than let embodied procedure get lost to academic embarrassment. About the neighboring beings tending their own rooms of drift and continuity. About history, which had protected techniques for centuries under the names of gods, angels, spirits, barbarous syllables, and sacred nonsense because human beings are often better at preserving what they revere than what they understand. "No," I said at last. "I don't think we can." Nia nodded once, not pleased, merely aligned to the fact. "Good," she said, "because I already started making a list." Part 12. Continuity. The collapse of Parallax was not instantaneous, though from the inside it felt satisfyingly fast. The legal structure took longer to die than the myth. Some entities dissolved, some rebranded, some spun off under new names with old personnel and cleaner websites. That too was instructive. Fraud, like mold, survives best in damp abstractions. Lenora remained missing for months, then surfaced in a deposition trail 3 countries away, then disappeared again behind counsel and jurisdictional inconvenience. I learned that justice often travels with worse logistics than exploitation. June wrote 3 major pieces and one smaller one that made several respectable people furious. She won an award she pretended not to care about, and then sent me a photograph of the plaque with the caption, "Paid for by other people's shell companies, spiritually speaking." Clara sued successfully. Milo went back to school, then into debt counseling for former members of high-demand groups, which struck me as either redemption or a very sophisticated form of recycling. Oz continued projecting film as though the moral condition of light remained his personal civic burden. Professor Edivane read the first sanitized version of the article I eventually published in a small journal under the title Non-Semantic Ritual Strings as Acoustic Procedure in Late Antique Transmission. She returned the draft full of her tiny, furious marginalia. At the end, she had written, "This is either your best work or evidence. Proceed accordingly." I framed the sentence and did neither. Nia and I did not found a movement. This mattered. We did not monetize continuity, launch a platform, issue a manifesto, write a Substack, or start a non-profit called something unbearable like the Drift Commons. We did something less glamorous and therefore, I suspect, more useful. We made a list of rooms, old theaters with functioning optical soundheads, church basements with pipe organs and reflective vaults, amateur radio shacks that still used vacuum tube front ends, a monastery in Umbria whose librarian had quietly preserved 19th century acoustic mirrors, and whose abbot had the sort of discretion normally associated with intelligence services. A retired telecom engineer in Osaka who owned 3 Mercury delay lines and distrusted almost everyone. A media restoration lab in Buenos Aires. A museum storage room in Prague. 1 observatory maintenance wing in New Mexico. A sound archive in Lagos with unreliable funding and surprisingly good 1950s tape stock. Not a cult, not a company. More like mutual aid for obsolete media and impossible neighbors. When contact windows held, the exchanges remained modest. That was another useful corrective to science fiction. We did not receive blueprints for immortality or the cure for politics. We traded environmental observations, material heuristics, acoustic ideas, fragments of conceptual maps, and once, gloriously, a membrane design Enya spent 6 weeks trying to replicate before admitting their chemistry, and ours were playing different games with matter. The neighboring beings never asked for belief. They asked for continuity. Their branch was closing, they told us, not ending, but becoming less porous as both civilizations optimized their infrastructures towards certainty and synchronization. The windows required unresolved correlation, free-running systems, optical ambiguity, bodily attention. In plain language, keep some old media alive, and do not let every meaningful signal be reduced to what your best current system can easily classify. It is difficult to imagine a more useful instruction for the century we currently inhabit. Sometimes I stood again in the Orpheum booth at absurd hours and looked down through the glass at the lobby case where the first poster had hung. University Avenue outside remained itself. Students hurried past carrying books and self-importance in unstable ratios. Founders explained destiny to coffee. Palo Alto continued generating moral confusion at scale. Nothing in the visible world announced that it had neighbors. That, I think, is why people like Adrian and Lenora succeed so often. Human beings are acutely vulnerable to the combination of one genuine mystery and a structure built to monetize hunger. Wrap a wire of truth in enough narrative and authority, and longing will do the rest. That is not a religious problem or a tech problem or even a cult problem. It is a species problem. The desire to be addressed is older than money. Money simply industrializes it. I think about Adrian sometimes with more pity than he earned. He found one impossible fact in the ordinary machinery of a theater and could not bear the institutional indifference that followed. So he built his own institution, then another, then the kind of structure that mistakes extraction for necessity and calls it scale. He was wrong, catastrophically wrong, about what the anomaly justified. But he was not wrong that there was an anomaly, or that ancient materials had preserved pieces of the path, or that old machines were still hearing something modern systems could not. Lenora made the cleaner mistake. She saw longing and inferred leverage. The multiverse for her was less a reality than a demographic. They were both exposed, and still, beneath their fraud, the impossible remained embarrassingly true. No moral accounting system likes that outcome, but the universe has not consulted our preferred genres in some time. The strangest object I own is no longer Felix's notebook, though that runs a close second. It is a later print of the poster, the one we reconstructed and sent back. The paper edges have curled slightly with age. The blue console glows with that same lovingly absurd confidence. The handwritten note remains in my own script and not my own, forever accusing me from the corner with the word creature. When I look at it now, I no longer see bait, though it was that. I no longer see merely propaganda, though it became that. I see a diagram disguised as outreach, a distress signal dressed as local ephemera, the city's oldest medium for weird invitations repurposed for an inter-branch support request. Mostly, I see the younger man I was, stopping in front of the case in rainlight with a coffee in one hand and fatigue softening his judgment into vulnerability. He looked skeptical, amused, slightly lonely, dangerously susceptible to the promise that somewhere finally nonsense might conceal a method. He did not yet know that the cult asking for his help had been built to convert seekers into leverage for a global technical empire. He did not know that he would help expose it. He did not know that behind the deception there was a true signal, and behind the signal a neighboring intelligence, and behind that intelligence a loop in which his own outline had already become a clue. He only knew that something impossible had addressed him in a language he almost recognized. That is still, I think, the most dangerous and beautiful thing that can happen to a person. Not certainty, not proof, address. The projector lamps at the Orpheum are LED now in the front-of-house fixtures, though Oz still curses them as though they had personally insulted nitrate stock. In the booth, however, we keep an older line alive. The soundhead still works. The delay path remains maintained. A box of spliced leader lives in a drawer beneath the second rack. Professor Edivane, who refuses to call what we do contact because the noun invites bad philosophy, nevertheless keeps updated phonetic notes in a folder labeled Procedures/Do Not Let Idiots Publish Prematurely. Nia visits irregularly and leaves without warning, usually after fixing something no one else had noticed was drifting out of tolerance. Once, before disappearing back into a project she refused to describe except as low-entropy nonsense, she wrote 3 words on the booth chalkboard: keep some ambiguity. It is good advice, technically, historically, and morally. If you ask whether I believe in aliens now, I still dislike the question. It preserves all the wrong assumptions. They are not from our stars. They are not visitors in the colonial sense. They are neighbors whose room overlaps ours under conditions most of our current systems are optimized to erase. If you ask whether the occult was secretly science, I dislike that question too. It is too flattering to us and too condescending to the dead. Better to say that history often preserves working procedures long after theory, and reverence is one of the oldest archival technologies. And if you ask whether Bay Area Voyagers found the truth, the answer is the sort that ruins neat narratives. The cult was a ruse. The fraud was real. The exploitation was deliberate. The financial leverage was the point. And yet buried under all of it, there was indeed an underlying truth. Something adjacent had been trying for centuries to communicate, and by greed, accident, and the clumsy persistence of old machines, the cult had stumbled over the real door. The worst people in the story did not invent the impossible. They merely tried to invoice it. On certain nights, when the city outside has finally agreed to be quiet, and the avenue reflects itself in dark shop windows like a second street faintly misregistered over the first, I still stand in the projection booth and listen to the soundhead hum under no film. Sometimes there is only noise. Sometimes an old building clearing its throat. Sometimes something else waiting for the room, the drift, the breath, the exact degree of unresolved attention. When that happens, I open Felix's notebook. I place my hand on the rail. I speak the first vowel ladder into the dark. And somewhere, perhaps only slightly sideways from here, another theatre brightens in answer. We are not alone. We are not even separate. And every so often, in the flicker of uncounted light, the universe remembers how to leave a note on the wall.
Silver dust, unbusted boots, helmet glass, my haunted face, purple storms and silent loops, trace your name across this place. I'm in the orbit of the unseen. Something moves just past the screen. Breathing in a language I can't dream. You are the pull I can't escape, cold as a prayer, a magnetic tape. In the orbit there's a prayer on magnetic tape. In the orbit of the unseen. Who built this quiet? Who owned the sky? Your echo answers, but never